My name is Priya Nair. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a contracts paralegal. I read the fine print on things the way other people read the weather. Force of habit. Professional reflex. I've been doing it since I was 22. So when my brother Rohan signed a 60-page property transfer document at our grandmother's dining table without reading a single page, I noticed. I didn't say anything. I was holding a cup of chai. He was using his own pen, the silver one our father gave him when he passed the civil service exam. He signed all 11 signature lines in under 4 minutes and handed the document back to our Uncle Suresh with a smile that I can only describe as the smile of a man who has never read a contract in his life. I set my chai down very quietly. What happened in the next 19 days cost my uncle 3 properties, a business license, and a partnership that had taken him 8 years to build. It did not cost me a single raised voice. It did not cost me a family dinner, or a friendship, or a night of sleep. What it did cost was 19 days of very careful reading, which, if you've ever met a paralegal with a personal grudge and a spotless work calendar, you will understand is not a cost at all. Welcome to Calm Betrayal TV. This is where quiet people finish things. If you've ever watched someone sign something they shouldn't have, drop a comment with the word pen, and stay with me. I want to show you what happens when the person who reads the fine print is also the one it was meant to bury. Let me tell you about my grandmother first, because everything that mattered began with her. Priya Nair was born in 1941 in a small town in Kerala. She came to Bengaluru in 1967 with 2 suitcases and a husband who died 9 years later, leaving her with 4 children, a half-built house, and a stubbornness that, according to everyone who knew her, was not stubbornness at all, but simply an extraordinarily precise sense of what was hers. By 1985, she had turned the half-built house into a full one. By 1982, she had purchased 2 adjacent plots. By 2001, she had built a small commercial property on one of them, 4 rental units on the ground floor, 2 on the first, and a rooftop terrace that she rented to a catering company every wedding season for 22 years. She did all of this with a 6th-grade education, a ledger she kept in her own handwriting, and the kind of methodical patience that I think she passed directly to me and skipped everyone in between. She had 4 children. My father, her eldest, died when I was 11. Rohan was 8. After that, my grandmother became our closest family. We spent every summer in Bengaluru, sleeping in the upstairs room with the ceiling fan that wobbled in a slow circle all night. She taught me to keep accounts. She showed me her ledger once, sitting at the dining table under the window, running her finger along columns of numbers the way other grandmothers run their fingers along embroidery patterns. She said, "Priya, no one can take what you write down properly." She was right, mostly. The trouble came from what other people were writing down instead. My uncle Suresh is my grandmother's 3rd child. He is 62, runs a mid-sized construction materials firm, and has the particular confidence of a man who has always assumed that family relationships exempt him from the need to be precise. He is not a cruel person. He is not even, I think, a dishonest one in the way people are dishonest when they know they're lying. He is something more specific than that. He is a man who has spent 30 years believing that being the one who handled things gave him the right to decide what things meant. He managed my grandmother's accounts for the last decade of her life. She trusted him because he was present. She called him at midnight when the catering company's generator died mid-wedding. He drove 2 hours on a Sunday to fix a leak in the 2nd rental unit. He did these things genuinely and without complaint. And somewhere in the doing of them he developed a belief. I think it was gradual, like water finding a crack, that the properties were his to decide about. My grandmother died in March. She left a will. The will had been drafted by a solicitor and was witnessed and registered and entirely legal. It left the primary residence to Rohan and me, jointly. It left the commercial property and the 2 adjacent plots to be divided equally among her 4 children. Suresh received his legal quarter. It was, by any measure, a fair will. The document Rohan signed at the dining table, 6 weeks after the funeral, was not the will. I had driven down from Pune the day before. Rohan called me at 7 in the morning and said Suresh Mama had some paperwork he needed signed about the property management, and could I come for a few days? I said yes. I work remotely on Wednesdays and Thursdays. I packed a bag and didn't ask what kind of paperwork because I assumed it was the routine documentation that follows a death, utility transfers, municipal records, that kind of thing. The document was 62 pages printed on legal-size paper, stapled in 3 sections. Suresh placed it on the dining table alongside a glass of water, and the explanation that it was a property management consolidation agreement, standard practice in situations like this. Nothing complicated. Rohan just needed to authorize him to continue handling the accounts while things got settled. Rohan signed it in 4 minutes. I stayed at the table after Suresh left. The document was gone. He'd taken it with him. But I'd photographed 7 pages on my phone while Suresh was in the kitchen refilling the water. Old habit. I read them that night. By midnight, I had read them 3 times. By 12:47, I had opened my laptop and pulled up the Karnataka Registration Act. What Rohan had signed was not a property management agreement. It was a composite transfer instrument, a legally structured document that, under the specific provisions of Section 17 of the Transfer of Property Act, would, upon registration, convey Rohan's co-ownership rights in the primary residence to Suresh, along with an irrevocable authorization allowing Suresh to lease or sublease the commercial property without Rohan's or my co-signed approval for a period of not less than 25 years. There were 11 signature lines. Rohan had signed all 11. The document had not yet been registered. Under Karnataka law, a transfer instrument must be registered at the sub-registrar's office within 4 months of execution. But registration could be expedited. Suresh had connections at the sub-registrar's office. I knew this because he had mentioned it at dinner twice, casually, the way people mention things they consider assets. I closed my laptop at 1:15, sat in the dark of the upstairs room with the wobbling ceiling fan, and made a list on a legal pad I always carry. Not a list of emotions. A list of steps. If you've ever stayed up past midnight with a legal pad and a very cold cup of tea, making a list that the other person in that house has no idea you're making, drop a comment with the word list. Because this is where the quiet ones begin. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when a paralegal who has read 10,000 contracts sits down with the one that was written to erase her. I'll see you in a few minutes. The first thing I did the next morning was call my senior colleague Deepa. Deepa has been a property law paralegal for 19 years and is the kind of person who reads transfer deeds the way other people read novels. For pleasure. For plot. For the parts the writer didn't want you to notice. I read her the 7 pages I had photographed. She was quiet for 40 seconds. Then she said, "Priya, has this been registered yet?" "Not yet." She said, "How many days do we have?" I said, "I don't know." "Suresh knows people at the sub-registrar's office." She said, "Then you have less time than you think, and more leverage than he expects. Call me tonight with the full document." I called Rohan at 9. I told him I needed to see the full document he had signed. He said Suresh Mama had it, but he could call and ask for a copy. I told him not to call Suresh. I told him very calmly, the way I tell clients things when I need them to hear and not panic, that I had seen enough of the document to have some questions, and I would like to read the rest before he and Suresh had any further conversations about property matters. Rohan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How bad is it?" I said, "Rohan, have you ever read a contract before signing it?" He said, "You're going to say something unkind right now, aren't you?" I said, "I'm going to say something accurate. Don't call Suresh. Don't sign anything else. I'll be here for the week." Then I went downstairs, had breakfast, and told my grandmother's small ceramic elephant on the windowsill that we were going to be busy. 19 days is enough time to correct a mistake, if you know exactly which document to correct it with. Day 2, I drove to the sub-registrar's office in Bengaluru under the pretext of requesting a certified copy of my grandmother's registered will. While I was there, I asked, very ordinarily, the way you ask for directions, how long expedited registration typically took for property transfer instruments submitted in the last 30 days. The clerk said it varied. I asked what varied it. He mentioned volume of submissions and completeness of documentation. I asked whether an instrument could be held pending legal review if a registered objection was filed. He said, "That depends on the nature of the objection." I thanked him and left with my certified copy, and a great deal of useful information. Day 3, I called Deepa. She had found the mechanism. Under Section 41 of the Specific Relief Act, A temporary injunction can be sought from a civil court restraining the registration of an instrument if there is prima facie evidence that the instrument was obtained through misrepresentation, fraud, or suppression of material facts. The burden of proof for a prima facie case is not the same as a full trial. You need enough to show the court that there is a serious question to be tried. I had 7 pages of a 62-page document describing itself as a property management consolidation agreement while actually being a transfer instrument. Rohan had signed it believing the first description. He had not been told the second. That was suppression of material facts. That was misrepresentation. That was, in the language of the Act, enough. Day 5, I secured the full document. Suresh's junior associate, who had no idea what he was handing over, emailed a PDF copy to Rohan after Rohan said he needed it for his own records. Rohan forwarded it to me at 8:42 in the evening. I read it in 3 hours. I made notes in the margin of my legal pad with a red pen. By midnight, I had filled 11 pages. The document was, I will say this honestly, well drafted. Suresh's lawyer knew their craft. The transfer provisions were buried in Section 8 of a document whose title, table of contents, and first 4 pages were entirely about property management administration. An ordinary person reading the first 20 pages would have no idea what Section 8 said. An ordinary person reading Section 8 itself, without the context of property law, might not have understood what it conveyed. But the provisions were there. They were not hidden in the legal sense. They were disclosed in the document. The suppression was in the description of the document, not the document itself. And that distinction is what made our case. Suresh had told Rohan it was a property management agreement. It was not. He had told Rohan it was standard practice. It was not. He had not mentioned that it would transfer Rohan's ownership rights. That was the misrepresentation. And Rohan had signed it based on that misrepresentation, without independent legal advice, within 6 weeks of his grandmother's funeral. Day 7. Deepa connected me to an advocate named Krishnamurthy who had 30 years in property law and the measured cadence of a man who had seen everything twice. I presented the facts in 11 minutes. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "The injunction application is strong, but the stronger play is the preliminary legal notice." I asked him to explain. He said, "Before you file with the court, you send a legal notice to Suresh through registered post. The notice informs him that you are aware of the nature of the document, that you are prepared to file for injunction and a declaration suit, and that you are giving him 7 days to voluntarily cancel the instrument and confirm in writing that he will not seek registration. If he cancels, you avoid court. If he doesn't, you file, and the notice itself becomes evidence of his awareness and deliberate intent to proceed despite objection." I said, "What if he registers it in those 7 days?" Krishnamurthy said, "That's why we also file a precautionary caveat with the sub-registrar simultaneously. A caveat is a formal notice to the registration office that an interested party objects to registration of any instrument affecting this property. Under Rule 89 of the Karnataka Registration Rules, the sub-registrar must notify the cavator before proceeding. That buys us time, even if he moves fast." I said, "How quickly can you draft the notice and caveat?" He said, "I can have both ready by tomorrow afternoon." I said, "I'd like them by morning." He paused. Then he said, "Are you a paralegal or a solicitor?" I said, "I'm Priya Nair's granddaughter." He said, "I'll have them by 9. That evening, I sat with Rohan at the dining table. The same table where he had signed the document 2 weeks before. The ceramic elephant was on the windowsill. The ceiling fan was on. I put the full 62-page document between us, open to Section 8. I had highlighted 3 paragraphs in yellow. I said, "Read those 3 paragraphs." He read them. It took 4 minutes. He read them slowly, the way people read things when they are beginning to understand that they should have read them earlier. When he finished, he looked at the highlighted text for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I gave him the house." I said, "Not yet. The document hasn't been registered." He said, "He told me it was just a management thing. He said it was what Amma would have wanted, that she always trusted him with the accounts." I said, "She trusted him with the accounts, not the deed." Rohan put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a while. I didn't say anything. I have learned, in my professional life, that the moment after someone understands a bad document is not the moment for talking. It is the moment for sitting with them in it. After a few minutes, he looked up. He said, "Can you fix it?" I said yes, but you need to understand something first. This is going to be uncomfortable. Suresh is going to receive a legal notice from an advocate. It's going to be formal, and it's going to be public record. He is going to be angry. Rohan said. He took Amma's house. I said, almost. He said, then do what you need to do. I said, one more thing. When you talk to Suresh between now and the time this resolves, and he will call you, you say one sentence. Please speak to my lawyer. That's all. You don't explain, you don't argue, you don't reassure him. 4 words. Can you do that? He said, I'm not good with confrontation. I said, that's why I'm giving you a sentence short enough to read without signing it. He laughed. It was the first time in 2 weeks I had heard him laugh. It sounded like our father, slightly, around the edges, and I turned to look at the ceiling so he wouldn't see my face. If you've ever had to hand someone you love the 4 words that will protect them because they don't know how to say them themselves, drop a comment with the word for. That's what this kind of protection costs. Not a fight. Not a falling out. Just 4 words and the steadiness to mean them. Subscribe. The next part is where Suresh finds out what a caveat is. The legal notice was delivered to Suresh by registered post on the morning of day 9. Krishnamurthy had written it in the precise, restrained language of a man who has spent 30 years saying very serious things in very measured tones. It named the instrument, cited the sections of the Transfer of Property Act and the Specific Relief Act, identified the misrepresentation, stated Rohan's position, and gave Suresh 7 days to confirm voluntary cancellation in writing. The caveat was filed with the sub-registrar that same morning. Suresh called Rohan at 11:14. I was sitting across the dining table when Rohan's phone rang. I watched him look at the screen, look at me, and pick up. He said, "Hello, Suresh Mama." There was a pause. I could hear the tone of the call from across the table. Not the words, but the cadence. The register of a man who is used to managing situations with volume. Rohan said, "Please speak to my lawyer." He set the phone down. He had used 4 words where I told him to use 4 words. I looked at him. He was holding the phone in both hands and breathing carefully. He said, "He's calling back." I said, "Let it ring." It rang 4 more times that day. We let all 4 ring. Suresh called me on day 10. I picked up because I wanted him to know that I was aware of exactly what he had done and was not avoiding the conversation. I simply was not conducting it on his terms. He said, "Priya, this is a misunderstanding. The document was standard practice for estate management in situations like this. Your mother's, your grandmother's properties needed consolidated management." Rohan understood what he was signing. I said, "Suresh Mama, with respect, the document Rohan signed contains a transfer instrument under Section 17 of the Transfer of Property Act. A property management agreement does not contain a transfer instrument. I'd prefer to keep this in the legal channel at this point. Krishnamurthy's number is in the notice." He said, "You are making this into something it isn't. I practically raised you children after your father died." I said, "I know. And I am grateful for that. This is still a legal matter." He said Kamala would be horrified by this. I said, "Amma kept a ledger for 40 years precisely so that no one could take what she had built. I think she would recognize what I'm doing." He hung up. I sat in the upstairs room for a long time after that, looking at the ceiling fan, thinking about the distance between gratitude and obligation and the place where people like Suresh confuse one for the other. My grandmother's second child, my Aunt Vimala, called on day 11. She lives in Chennai. She is a gentle woman who has spent her entire life trying to prevent arguments by not acknowledging they are happening. She said in her very soft voice that she hoped the situation with Suresh would resolve itself because the family had already been through so much with Amma's passing, and she was sure there had been a misunderstanding. And perhaps if Priya just spoke to Suresh directly and explained the concern, things could be sorted without lawyers. I said, "Chithi, Rohan signed a document that transferred his ownership of Amma's house. That is not a misunderstanding about tone or intent. It is a document. I have 62 pages of it. She said property matters are so complicated though. Suresh understands these things. I said, that's precisely the problem. She said nothing. In the background I could hear television. I waited. Then she said, you were always so much like Amma. I said I hope so. She said. She would have done the same thing. She would have been just as difficult about it. She used the word difficult the way my grandmother used to use the word determined, like a compliment she'd decided wasn't one. I thanked her and said goodnight. The fourth child, my uncle Ravi, who lives in Hyderabad and has always had the particular talent of arriving after problems have been resolved and before credit has been assigned, called on day 13 to say he supported the action and hoped it would be finished quickly, because he was planning a trip to Bengaluru and preferred not to walk into a conflict. I told him I would do my best to schedule the resolution around his travel plans. I don't think he understood the sarcasm. He said, thank you, Priya, you were always the sensible one. I said goodnight. Suresh's lawyer called Krishnamurthy on day 14. They spoke for 40 minutes. Krishnamurthy called me afterward and said, in a tone that told me he was pleased, he wants to discuss settlement terms. I said, the terms are simple. Voluntary cancellation of the instrument, notarized acknowledgement that the cancellation is unconditional, a written confirmation that he will not seek any future instrument affecting the primary residence without co-signed consent from both Rohan and me, and a full accounting of all transactions on the commercial property from the date of my grandmother's death to the present. Krishnamurthy said, the accounting will be the difficult one. I said, I know. That's why it's on the list. The accounting was the difficult one. Not because Suresh had been stealing. The numbers, when they came due on day 17, appeared clean, or close enough to clean that the discrepancies could be attributed to administrative lag rather than intent. But the fact of the accounting itself, the fact that Suresh had to sit with his lawyer and produce 3 months of transaction records for a property he had begun treating as his own, was, I think, the most clarifying part of the entire 19 days. It is one thing to take something. It is another to have to enumerate, line by line, everything you took it for. The voluntary cancellation was executed on day 19. Krishnamurthy drove it to the notary himself. Rohan and I sat at the dining table and waited. The ceiling fan turned. The ceramic elephant sat on the windowsill. I had a cup of chai, and this time I did not set it down before I finished it. At 30:47 in the afternoon, Krishnamurthy called and said, it's done. Rohan let out a long breath. I looked at the windowsill. I thought about my grandmother running her finger along a column of numbers. No one can take what you write down properly. I said, right, Amma. Rohan looked at me. I hadn't meant to say it aloud. I pretended I hadn't. He pretended I hadn't. He pretended he hadn't heard. We are good at that, the two of us. We have been protecting each other's dignity since we were children. Some things you don't grow out of. You just get better tools. 3 months later, Suresh and I have not spoken since day 10. His lawyer sent Krishnamurthy a curt acknowledgement of the completed cancellation and nothing else. My aunt Vaimala sends me WhatsApp messages on festival days, slightly warmer than before, as though the distance between us has clarified something she didn't want to name directly. My uncle Ravi came to Bengaluru in June as planned. He sat in the same dining room, ate the same kind of food, and told a story about a conflict at his office that he had resolved very diplomatically. He did not mention the 19 days. He did not mention the 19 days. He did not mention Suresh. He mentioned, twice, that he had always thought Priya was the sensible one in the family. I said, thank you, Ravi Mama. I did not say anything else. Rohan is still in Bengaluru. He has been going through our grandmother's ledgers, which we found in a metal box under the bed in the upstairs room. There are 43 of them. He photographs each page and sends them to me in batches. I have started a spreadsheet. It is, so far, the most precise record of a life's work that I have ever seen, and I have spent 9 years reading other people's documents. Last week, he sent me a photograph of an entry from 1988. In the margin, in our grandmother's careful handwriting, was a note that said, always check the thing they say is routine. I stared at it for a long time. I texted back a single word, yes. The primary residence is still in both our names jointly, as the will intended. The commercial property is being managed by a licensed property management firm we hired together, with a joint sign requirement on all disbursements above 5,000 rupees. The sub-registrar's caveat was withdrawn after the cancellation. The accounting ledger from those 3 months is filed with Krishnamurthy's office and with mine. Suresh's construction materials firm, from what I understand, is operating normally. He did not lose it. That was never the goal. The goal was the house, the deed, the name on the document that my grandmother built. Those things are where they should be. What you protect isn't always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes it's the thing no one thought to read twice. The mahogany dining table is still there. I eat at it when I visit. The ceiling fan wobbles in the same slow circle it has wobbled since I was a child. The ceramic elephant is on the windowsill. My grandmother's ledger from 1988 sits on the shelf above the window, spine out like the others. 43 years of columns and margins, and a woman who believed, down to the last notation, that the things you write down properly belong to you. She was right. She was entirely right. Here's what 19 days of reading fine print will teach you. The quietest protection is almost always the most complete one. Suresh believed the advantage was in the document. He was right. He just had the wrong person reading it. If you've ever stood between someone you love and a piece of paper that was meant to take something from them, drop a comment with the words "I read it." That's the whole story. That's always the whole story. Share this with someone who needs to hear that careful is not the same as passive. Subscribe so the next story finds you. And if you know someone who is about to sign something, tell them to call you first.